Hey, what's going on? It's the Hipster here, and today in one of my first videos I'm going to be documenting something really important. It's the restoration of an Ernst Plischke attributed coffee table. So this coffee table to my left might not necessarily look like a great deal, right? It's very kind of linear, minimalist, unostentatious, and this is kind of precisely the point and why it appeals to me. Because it's a great example of what we see when we look at mid-century modernist design. Mid-century modernist design was all about function, right? And stripping form back to its kind of bare necessities and making things that looked simple but also elegant and quite timeless, while also being on the cutting edge of new ideas around design. And Ernst Plischke was a really pioneering figure in this, especially within New Zealand. So, who was Ernst Plischke, for starters? Well, I'll show you some excerpts of this wonderful book in a moment, but Ernst Plischke basically was an Austrian-born architect who spent a great deal of his formative years in Europe designing and building really interesting and unique mid-century modernist dwellings and buildings there. So when we're talking about mid-century modernism, we're really talking about the kind of time period from about the 1940s, late 1940s arguably, through into the kind of 1960s, perhaps into the early 70s. And Plischke was mostly working in the 40s and 50s. And quite crucially what he did was he moved to New Zealand. And New Zealand, it's on the other side of the world. It hadn't necessarily gone through the same kind of revolution that Europe and the States was in terms of modernism. And Ernst Plischke was one of the kind of European foreign architects who came and brought his approach to New Zealand. And he was really instrumental in designing and building a number of really important, not only homes, but buildings, including like churches within New Zealand, some of which I can show you images of from this wonderful book published by Bristol. What was really interesting about Ernst Plischke, but not necessarily unique, was he had a real thing for inbuilt furniture. So architects from this era often like to design a complete vision of their homes and dwellings. So this would extend not only to like the exterior of the building and the layout of the rooms, but actually the interior design as well, including the furniture that would sit in those rooms. So Ernst Plischke would design a lot of inbuilt furniture for his homes, and he would also design kind of incidental furniture that might find its way into those homes as well. So there are some wonderful chairs that he's designed, and what you're looking at is one of his most kind of well-known attributed pieces, a small kind of coffee table with a magazine rack. Now, this, as simple and kind of small as this piece is, it's actually a really rare piece of furniture in the history of New Zealand design. I've actually seen 3 of them in my time sort of looking at and collecting mid-century New Zealand designed furniture, but this was the first one that I was able to purchase, and I purchased it in pretty poor disrepair from a second-hand shop for a pretty paltry sum. Actually, it was under 10 New Zealand dollars, but it was in bad condition. So what I did was pretty much painstakingly dismantle, and much to the horror of a friend who saw it in its dismantled phase, really strip this piece of furniture right back to basics so that I could reassemble it and refinish it and make it kind of restored to its former glory. So how did I go about doing this? Well, it required a lot of work from my trusty friend, the heat gun. So this was finished with a really heavy varnish. I thought initially it was shellac, but I think it was actually a really kind of heavy polyurethane. So I went outside into fresh air to keep myself safe from the fumes that often come off poly when you start tearing into it with a heat gun. And I basically heated the surface, and I removed all of the polyurethane material with a carbide hook scraper. Now this is a really interesting and unique method that I've kind of gotten used to using, because a hook scraper or a carbide scraper, and I'll show an image of one of those in a moment if you're not sure what they look like, can kind of probably make a few furniture restorers sweat a bit. It's a pretty aggressive tool, but when used carefully it can act a little bit like a plane, and it can remove material quite aggressively if need be, but if you're kind of gentle and careful with it, you can do a really good job. So I use that to remove a lot of the material, strip it right back, and then I sanded it right down with my orbital sander. I think I used sort of a 120 grit because I didn't want to get too heavy into it at first. So I used a 120 and then into a 180 to get a nice smooth finish to it. And then I used a detail sander to really get it smooth and looking good. And quite a few places needed re-gluing, so there was a crack here that needed to be re-glued and clamped. And the table as it stands now requires this as well. So what I'll show you in a moment is the table as it currently is, and then in the next portion of the video I'll show you kind of how I've gone about re-gluing it and clamping it. And fingers crossed that we get the end result that I'm looking for. Once that's all done, what I'm going to do is refinish it with Danish oil as my preferred oil of choice, and I'm looking to do maybe 3 coats of that, and hopefully it will get this lovely oak to have a really nice kind of satin luster and make this table really look amazing. See you soon. Alright, so here you have it, the table clamped up, glued up, gonna leave it to dry overnight. Pretty stressful experience, if I'm honest. Had to bang glue around all different parts of the table, and then I had about 4 different sash clamps on the go, just trying to compress different areas of the table before that glue started to dry. And then clearly the central seam was like the biggest stress, and it took me quite a while to get it lined up. I think I've done it, but I'm not going to fully know until tomorrow when I remove the clamps and flip it over and have a look again. All these dowels were super stressful as well, getting them into position before I started compressing the table there. But I'm hoping that I've done an okay job, so I'll check back with you guys tomorrow and see how it turns out. Alright, so it's the next day, and it's time to undo these clamps and kind of see if things have worked out or not. So I'm going to cut to the obligatory time-lapse sequence. Here we go. Right, so I'm pretty happy with this. This has kind of come out just as I had hoped, if I'm really honest. That seam line has just matched up really nicely, and there's no kind of discernible gap there, so I'm super hyped about that. And the only thing maybe to kind of mention is this glue residue that you can see, which has kind of come up to the surface. As I've like squeezed that table together, it's just like popped up through that line, and this is not too big of an issue. I'll be able to remove that, and I'm going to run over the top surface with the orbital sander and then the detail sander anyway, just to get a really nice even finish to the top. And what I'm really looking forward to and really hyped on is that first coat of Danish oil, which is the next stage, and I can't wait to just see the color of the oak, that kind of honey luster that's going to kind of come up as the oil soaks into the surface of the timber. I'm really looking forward to that, because it's kind of the first point in the process where you really start to see the results of all that hard work. So wait for that one, it's going to be really good. Alright, so the table is ready to oil now. I'll talk a little bit about the prep that I just did. So you saw me sand it down, firstly with the orbital sander just to get rid of that glue and just even a few things out, and then with the detail sander just to get a nice even finish over the top. And then what I did, might be a surprise to some people, is whipped out my vacuum cleaner. And what I did with that is I just vacuumed the entire surface of the table, every kind of nook and cranny I could get to. That just removes any of that dust that's existing on the surface. What I find with a deeper grain wood like an oak is that because it's got that deep grain, the dust can kind of get into the little grooves there, and so it's really good to try and remove as much of that as you can, and then follow this up with a really good wipe down with mineral turpentine. Again, that just removes any of that residue that might be there, and it also just draws any kind of oil or dirt out of the surface of the wood, anything that might interfere with the application of the Danish oil, which is kind of the most crucial step of the process in a lot of ways. So onto the Danish oil application. So previously, when I used to do a lot of furniture restoration, I had a different method than the one that I'm going to use for this table. I call it the soak-in method, right? So basically, I'd use a paintbrush, and I would apply Danish oil really, really liberally to the surface of the wood, and then I would basically just leave it there to soak in. So the wood would look super duper wet, just basically laden with oil, and you'd have to leave it overnight for it to kind of soak in and dry. And it achieves really good penetration to the surface of the wood. But what I found with this method, and why I switched to the method that I'll explain in a moment, is that the oil would pool in certain areas on the wood, which wasn't always great, so you could get a slightly uneven finish, which actually required more application and more coats of oil than you perhaps wanted to do in the first place. And secondly, the cleanup was just a real drag. Like, you had the brush, and then you had to soak it in turpentine, and if you weren't kind of organized and cleaned up your brushes, you could end up ruining them, and you're just using way more solvents than I was really keen to. So I've switched to what I call just the basic wipe-on method. I just get a rag, and I apply the Danish oil. I'm using Rustin's original Danish oil. I just apply that oil to the rag, to the surface of the wood, and I basically just wipe it all over as evenly as I can, and then I leave it, and I just kind of keep doing this until I'm happy with the finish. Why this is good is you get a nice even coat. You don't get that kind of mass amount of oil just kind of sitting on the surface. You get a nice kind of, the first coat, yes, is quite a thin coat, but the more coats that you do, obviously you build up the layers of the oil. And also just the cleanup is much more convenient. Really crucially, what I do with my rags is they're kind of only really good for one application, which I know is like a little bit wasteful. But I take them, I hang them up outside, make sure I'm hanging them up nice and flat, because if you just kind of chuck up the rag and like biff it in the bin, they can spontaneously combust, and there are horror stories of people's houses burning down this way. So be careful with your oily rags. But yeah, I just find it way more convenient. I just get an old cotton bed sheet and cut it up into a whole bunch of different rags, and basically just use that for my application of Danish oil. So again, I'm going to bombard you with a pretty rad time lapse, and apply my first coat of Danish oil. And last but not least, definitely worth mentioning, if you're interested in furniture restoration and you're going to be using something like Danish oil, I highly recommend, like, firstly that you work in a well-ventilated area. I'm in my downstairs garage and the windows are open, and I've got doors that I can open as well if I really need to get some fresh air in here. But secondly, like, invest in one of these respirator units. They're just really good. You don't want to be inhaling these fumes if you can avoid it. It's not great stuff. So the kind of more protected you can be, the better. So without any further ado, let's get into business. Here, ladies and gents, is the end product. I'm going to cut to a montage of some images and some shots of the table from different angles so you can see the quality of the finish. But suffice to say, I'm really, really pleased with how this turned out. It was probably the most painstaking restoration that I've ever done, but I can definitely say that it's paid off with one of the highest quality finishes to any restoration that I've ever done. So hopefully you enjoyed the montage, and hopefully you've enjoyed seeing me take, I guess, a forgotten piece of furniture and restore it to as close to its former glory as I can manage myself. Keep tuned into my channel. I'm going to be uploading more videos in the future. I'm thinking maybe some more furniture restoration videos, some kind of DIY gardening videos as well. I've got lots of ideas, so maybe hit me up and tell me the types of things that you would like to see. Tell me how I could improve my videos. I've definitely learned a lot making this first one, so I'm going to aim to improve the next one. Probably have less of me talking would be one thing that I'll do a little bit differently. But definitely stay tuned to my channel, and yeah, hopefully big things coming. So thanks so much for watching. Give me a like, would be really appreciated as well. And here's the montage.